Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're talking about one of the most important skills in filling late season elk tags, and that's glassing. Not just glassing harder, but glassing smarter. When the pressure's been on for weeks, the rut is over, the weather is unpredictable, and elk have moved into survival mode, your ability to find them at a distance becomes your greatest advantage. Late season elk don't behave the same way they did in September. They no longer bugle across basins. They no longer push cows and, cruising the timber during daylight. They've tightened up. They've dropped elevation. They're using cover more than ever, and they're watching their back trails. If you want to turn late season time into a real shot opportunity, you need to find them first, and that starts behind the glass. In this episode, I'm going to break down my approach to late season glassing based on over 3 decades of experience chasing elk through deep snow, brutal cold, and end of season conditions where every decision counts. I'll walk you through how I pick glassing locations, how I scan terrain, how thermals and shadows change what you can and can't see, and how to interpret elk body language when they don't want to be found. This isn't theoretical. It's field-proven, practical knowledge that will help you find more elk, make better decisions, and increase your chances when everyone else is burning boot leather in the wrong spots. Let's get into it. Before we can glass effectively in the late season, we've got to understand how elk behave this time of year. And I mean really understand it, not just where they might be, but how their daily decisions are driven by pressure, temperature, food scarcity, and survival instinct. The rut is over. Most bulls are no longer running themselves ragged chasing cows. They're recovering. They've been harassed, hunted, and stressed. And they've got one thing on their mind now: survive winter. That means their movements become more calculated. They start to favor security over visibility. They prioritize calories over curiosity. And they use terrain differently, more conservatively, more tactically. If you're still looking for rut behavior, you're going to waste a lot of time glassing empty hillsides. Where do late season elk tend to be? Let's break down what I've seen year after year. Bulls separate from cows, right? After the rut, mature bulls often pull back into smaller bachelor groups or go completely solo. They tend to move away from the bigger herds and drift into side drainages, benches, and thicker cover. You'll find them higher or lower depending on snowpack, but they'll always be where the pressure isn't. They follow the feed. This is critical. Late season elk live and die by food availability. Look for southern facing slopes where the sun keeps snow levels lower. Open grass pockets, wind-blown ridges, and burns with leftover forage are key spots. If they can find feed without exposing themselves, especially with some sun and a view behind them, they'll be there. Cover is everything. Elk bed where they feel safe. That usually means dark timber, thick north-facing drainages, or pockets of cover with a quick escape route. They'll glass you long before you glass them if you don't know how to pick your spots. That's why understanding their behavior is step one. If you know where elk want to be, your glass becomes a tool instead of a lottery ticket. What do daily movement patterns look like? Late season elk move less than they do during the rut, but they still have patterns. The biggest key? Timing. First light. This is your window. They'll often move from feeding to bedding areas during the first hour of daylight. If you're in position early, you'll catch them mid-transition. Midday. Activity drops significantly, especially in high pressure units, but this is a great time to glass bedding areas. Look for flickers of an ear, the curve of a rump or a tine catching the sunlight. Elk aren't gone, they're just still, right? They're not moving around a lot. Last light. Expect short, cautious movement towards feed. Don't expect a parade of elk walking into open parks. Bulls will often stage just inside cover and edge out slowly. If you're not set up early and watching the edges, you'll miss them entirely. Elk know where the pressure has been. They've survived all the seasons so far, right? They've dodged all the hunters. They're educated. Your job now is to think like a survivor. Glassing gives you distance, but only if you know what you're looking for and when to look. Let's cover choosing the right glassing locations for late season. If you want to find more elk in the late season, your glassing location is just as important as your optics. You can have the best glass in the world, but if you're looking at it from the wrong spot, at the wrong time, in the wrong terrain, you're not going to see anything. This is where a lot of hunters fall short. They look for comfort instead of coverage. They park themselves on an open knob, scan a few ridges, and then move on, convinced there are no elk in the area. But here's the truth. In the late season, the elk are probably there. They're just in smarter places. And unless you match their intelligence with your own, they'll stay hidden all day. What are the 3 qualities of a good glassing spot? After 3 decades of hunting western elk in all seasons, I've boiled a good glassing location down to 3 essential criteria. Late season makes these non-negotiable. Elevation advantage without exposure. You need enough height to see across ridges, side hills, or into bedding cover, but not so high you're skylining yourself, especially in open country or snow-covered ground standing on top of a ridge line that makes you a beacon. I always look for tucked-in elevation, benches, outcrops, or high points with cover behind or around them. If the sun is at your back and you're in the shadows, that's even better. Visibility into likely elk zones. It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people glass into wide open terrain with no feed, no cover, and no chance of holding elk. You want lines of sight into 3 types of zones. Feeding slopes, usually lower elevation, south or west facing, staging areas, edges of cover, and bedding areas, your north facing timber, brushy benches, your pockets of shelter. You want to be able to monitor all 3. Wind and thermal consistency. Even while glassing, don't ignore the wind. You might be several hundred yards away from elk, but your scent can still swirl down into their zone if you're careless, right? Watch for the thermals, early morning are going to be going down, midday they're going to be going up pretty stable. Try to look for stable crosswinds that aren't being redirected by terrain. It's subtle, but when you're glassing for hours, small scent mistakes can educate the elk. Over the years, here's where I've found consistent success glassing late season elk. Burn edges, especially burns from 2 to 5 years ago. These spots still hold regrowth and elk will feed along the transition line between burn and cover. Set up high and glass across those lines. Watch for the movement early and late. South-facing avalanche chutes or side paths. These warm quicker and often reveal patches of grass or exposed forage. Elk will bed just above or beside these areas, feeding cautiously. From across the drainage, they're often visible, especially if you glass slow and methodically. Low elevation creek bottoms with patchy timber. This is money in November. Elk will drop lower than you expect. If there's no pressure and there's good feed with access to water and cover, bulls will camp in these drainages for days. Get up on the wall of the canyon and look down and across, not just from above. Isolated benches on north-facing slopes. These are classic bedding areas, especially for post-rut bulls. They don't move much in these zones. You'll rarely see a full body. You're looking for a tine, a rump or an ear flicking. Pick apart the shadows. If your eyes aren't strained by how slow you're going, you're glassing too fast. Here's how to choose between those spots. If I've got multiple areas that fit the criteria, I always ask myself 3 things. Which one gives me the most terrain coverage without repositioning? Which one lets me approach glass and leave without being seen or winded? And which one puts me closest to a potential stalk if I spot something worth going after? The spot that checks all 3 is where I'll start. But here's the key: commitment. In the late season, elk aren't moving much during daylight. If you pick a good spot, don't bail after 20 minutes. I've watched bulls bedded for 6 hours without moving more than a head turn. Patience and stillness kill more bulls in late October and November than aggression ever will. Let's talk glassing strategy and how to pick apart terrain without missing elk. First, we need to be clear about something. Most hunters don't glass well. They look, they pan, they sweep, but they don't actually glass. Real glassing is slow. It's methodical. It's a discipline, not just a visual task. And in the late season, where elk often give you nothing more than the flick of an ear or the curve of a hip blending into dark timber, how you glass makes all the difference. Because if you're just scanning open slopes for full-bodied elk standing broadside in the sunshine, you're not going to see much. This section is all about redefining your glassing process. How you dissect country in a way that maximizes your odds of catching movement, color, or a shape where most guys miss it completely. So I want you to start wide and then go deep. When I first sit down behind the glass, I always take a wide look at the entire zone. This gives me a sense of light conditions, snow lines, terrain features, and where shadows are falling. I'm not looking for elk yet. I'm building a mental map of what's in front of me. Once I've taken it all in, I break the terrain into sections. Top third, middle third, bottom third. Then I grid each band vertically, left to right, then right to left, back and forth, slow as heck. If it's a big drainage, I'll divide the whole thing into quadrants and work each one methodically. And I don't just pan fast with my binos or spotter. I'll stop every few feet and park my eyes. I let them settle on a section of trees or a hillside and just watch for 20 to 30 seconds. That's when elk start to materialize. That's when you see an antler glint. That's when the patch of hair finally separates itself from the rock behind it. Try to look for contrast, not just shapes. This is a big one. People are often looking for an elk. That's a mistake. Elk in the late season don't give you that. You're looking for color contrast. You're looking for horizontal lines in a vertical world of trees, like a backlaying across a slope of trees. You're looking for light colored rump patches. You're looking for dark shadows that don't move like shadows. Sometimes I'll pick up an antler tip, catching just enough sun to look out of place. Or I'll notice how a stump hasn't moved for an hour, but something 30 yards behind it keeps swaying. It's almost always the thing that doesn't fit, that tiny break in the pattern that gives it away. Try to use your tripod always. If you're not glassing off tripod, you're leaving detail on the table, especially in the late season when you're often picking apart distant bedding areas or feeding zones across long drainages. A tripod lets you lock in and focus. It steadies your glass, lets you run slower pans, and removes micro vibrations that blur your vision without you even realizing it. It also forces you to stay on an area longer than your hand or shoulder naturally would. I carry a lightweight but stable tripod and use a pan head. It makes long sits way more productive. It keeps me in control instead of just reacting. So when should you use binos versus a spotting scope? Your binos, in my opinion, are for grid work and wide terrain scanning. Your spotter is for verification and micro detail work. I personally use a pair of 9-power Mavens for general glassing, and once I pick something up or want to really pick apart an area, I'll switch to the spotter to confirm, maybe sometimes whether it's an elk, or, maybe sometimes it's determining what size of elk I'm looking at, or to make sure that I'm not missing something that was bedded. Late season glassing is where the spotter earns its keep. Picking out antler tips from 800 yards to a mile away in a timbered canyon, that's where a spotter can really shine. Confirming a bedded bull on a bench that hasn't moved in hours, or watching an opening until dusk, waiting for something to materialize. If you're trying to count points, read behavior, or prep for a stalk, you need that reach and clarity. Make sure you know how to use natural rest points. This one is underrated. Don't just scan nonstop until your eyes are fried. I try to build in mental and visual rest points. A tall snag, or a burned out stump, a rock formation, things that anchor my grid so I know where to come back to. I'll scan to a marker, reset, and then scan again. It gives your brain a break. It helps you keep track of where you've already glassed, and it reduces the chances of skipping over a section completely because your eyes zoned out. Lighting and shadows matter more than you think, too. Glassing during the midday is tough because of glare and flat light. Late evening is hard because of deep shadows. But every lighting condition has its advantages if you know how to work with it. For morning light, use it to your back. Catch the glint of antlers or body color as elk move into the shadows. On overcast days, those are best for spotting elk on the move because shadows don't mask their motion. Late light, watch the edges where the sun hits and where timber shadows meet open feed. Elk love those in-between zones. And try to remember, slow is fast. It's easy to panic. You glass hard for 15 minutes, see nothing and think, I've got to move. But patience is your superpower in the late season. Some of my best finds have come 45 minutes into glassing the same ridge. I'll reglass a spot I already looked at only to catch movement I didn't see the first 3 times. Elk don't always appear, they kind of emerge, and that emergence only happens if you're still enough to notice it. So try not to race the process. Settle in. Work the terrain like it owes you something, because when it finally gives up that bull you've been hunting all season, it'll feel like it does. Real quick, let's dive into interpreting elk behavior from afar and what they're telling you before you move. Glassing elk isn't just about locating animals, it's about reading them. If you're only watching to figure out where they are, you're missing the far more valuable question here, and that's what are they doing and why? In the late season, every movement an elk makes, every step, pause, bed, head turn is telling you something. It's showing you how pressured they feel. It's showing you what they trust, what they're watching, and what they're avoiding. If you know how to read that body language, you'll know when to move, when to stay put, and when to strike. And that difference, that's what turns sightings into punch tags. If elk are actively feeding in the open, there's a window of opportunity. This usually means they feel secure, they haven't been blown out recently, and they're focused on calories. Watch how they feed. Are they grazing fast and glancing over their shoulders constantly? That's a pressured elk. Are they lazily feeding, pausing often, chewing, bedding briefly, then resuming? That's an elk that feels safe. That's an elk you can plan around. In the late season, I especially watch for bulls feeding on south-facing ridges in the last hour of light. If they're willing to step into the open at that time, you've got a good shot at putting a plan together for tomorrow morning. Bedding behavior is often the most critical behavior to understand in late season elk, especially for bulls. They bed early and they bed hard. Once they pick a spot, they'll stay put for hours, sometimes all day, unless spooked or weather shifts. So here's what I watch for. The direction they're facing when they bed. It tells me what they're watching, right? If their head is pointed toward a trail or open slope, they're monitoring that direction. Frequency of head turns or ear flicks lets me gauge how alert they are. Constant scanning usually means they're on edge. Body orientation and shade can also give you clues. Bulls will position themselves for thermals, shade, and cover. If they're tucked in and tight, they're comfortable. If they're on a point or ridge spine, they're monitoring for danger. When I spot a bedded bull, I don't just assume he's done for the day. I try to study him. I watch how often he stands to reposition. I track how the thermals are moving through his area. And if I'm planning a stalk, I let his body language determine whether I go now, later, or not at all. Real quick, how would I determine what the thermals are doing where he's at, right? You have to understand that thermals are a function of heat, right? The sun heating the earth. So if he's on a sunny slope, right, maybe he's bedded in the shade of a tree or a rock. But if he's on a sunny slope, you know you're going to have rising thermals, right? If he's tucked deep into a very shaded pocket, or cut, you could have downhill thermals there. So just be aware of what you're going to encounter with the rising or falling thermals depending on what the sun and shade are doing where he's at. Try to also watch for grouping and separation, right? After the rut, bulls separate from cows, and reading how elk group tells you a lot about what kind of animal you're looking at and how you should proceed, right? Solo bulls are usually older and more pressured. They'll often choose tougher to glass locations. So if I find one, I know I'm probably looking at a more mature bull. My stalk will be even slower, even quieter, and more calculated. Small bachelor groups are more relaxed, but they're still careful. Watch which bull seems to lead. He'll usually determine bedding locations and when the group moves. Cow-calf groups will often be down lower, closer to food and water. They're also more likely to attract attention from other hunters. I use them as a thermometer for pressure in the area. If they're nervous or high-strung, something's probably bumped them recently. Try to note posture and pace. This one's subtle, but over time you start to recognize it. Posture tells you everything. Upright, high head movement, alert, spooked, or unsure. Probably just caught wind or heard something. Low head, smooth movement with ears relaxed. They're confident, they're undisturbed, right? Quick stops and frequent looking back, that's an elk that either heard something unusual or is being followed. Watch those behaviors and it can tip you off to other unseen elk or another hunter on the move. Try to remember there is value in watching, not just acting. It's tempting to glass up an elk and immediately start closing the distance, but in the late season, that can backfire fast. Often the better move is to watch a little longer. Let the elk tell you how committed they are to that spot. Let the thermals stabilize. Let the day unfold so you know their travel direction and patterns. In late October on, movement is minimal. If you jump the gun, you might blow a bedded bull that had no reason to leave otherwise. But if you stay disciplined and observe long enough to understand his routine, you can plan a stalk that puts you within bow range or rifle range without ever altering him, right? That's how real success happens in the late season. Not from rushing, not from guessing, but from paying attention to what the elk are already showing you. Let's talk about the other side of glassing, the side a lot of people don't prepare for, because it's not just about finding elk. It's about being the kind of hunter who doesn't burn out after one ridge or 2 hours. If you want consistent success in the late season, you've got to become a master of sitting still, staying focused, and making every hour behind the glass count. You can't expect elk to show up on your timeline. You've got to outlast them. And if you're mentally tired, physically uncomfortable, or glassing lazily, those elk will stay hidden while you pack up and walk away empty. So set up to stay put. The first rule here is comfort. That's a strategy. If your glassing position is freezing you out, cramping your knees, or frying your neck, you're not going to last long enough to succeed. So I always try to build a glassing setup like I'm staying for hours, because a lot of times I am. Here's what that looks like in practice. I bring a pad or insulated seat to sit on a rock or frozen ground without losing body heat. I position myself with my back against a tree, rock, or pack so that I can stay stable and reduce fatigue. I layer up or bring in extra layers, knowing that I'll be glassing before first light when it's brutally cold and still glassing in the sun hours later when I'm overheating. I try to use vents and zippers and glove swaps like tools, right? I stash snacks, water, and extra layers right at my feet so I don't have to dig through my pack and risk noise or movement at the wrong time. The point is, build your glassing post like a sniper hide, because the longer you can stay still and stay sharp, the better your odds get with every passing hour. This is where the real work begins. Staying focused for 3 to 5 hours while looking at a sea of trees or hills, especially when nothing seems to be moving, is hard, but it's also where the game is won. Here's how I try to manage the mental load. I take breaks, but never fully check out, right? Every 30 to 45 minutes, I'll pause my grid, take a few deep breaths, look away from the glass, blink my eyes hard, maybe eat a snack, drink some water, then I get right back into it. I rotate tasks, so sometimes it'll be binos for 20 minutes, spotter for some detail work, then naked eye scanning for skyline, long distance movement, or just to kind of take it in and look for somewhere else that I want to glass. It helps keep the brain fresh. I try to build in goals. I'm going to glass this whole basin until 10:30 no matter what. That commitment gives me structure and prevents me from quitting too soon. I try to write down what I've seen a lot of times, even if it's nothing. I keep my brain engaged, tracks, movement patterns, helps me mentally log what I've been looking at, right? If you treat glassing like a passive activity, you'll miss more than you see. But if you treat it like an active job with a rhythm, a system, and checkpoints, now this sounds technical, but it matters. If your eyes are strained, your brain checks out, and you're going to miss elk that are right there in front of you. So here's what I do to try to manage that. Oftentimes I'll close my eyes every 15 minutes for a full minute while taking deep nasal breaths. I blink slowly and deliberately between grid passes to reset my focus and prevent dryness. I switch eyes occasionally if one starts to feel strained, especially with the spotter. I clean my lenses regularly. You'd be amazed how fast a dirty lens can wear you out mentally without you realizing it. If your glassing session is making you feel drained instead of dialed, chances are your eyes need to reset. Try to use technology, but don't rely on it. Yes, I have a phone with me with OnX all the time. Yes, I mark waypoints when I see something interesting. But here's the line I try not to cross. I never replace glassing with digital wandering, right? Too many guys glass for 10 minutes, then bury their heads in their phones looking for better spots. And a lot of times that's a trap. It pulls your focus from the terrain right in front of you, and terrain that could hide bull elk right now, right? Use your tools, but don't let them distract you from the job at hand. Technology should support your glassing, not replace it. The grind pays off. I've glassed up bulls at noon. I've spotted movement at 2 p.m. when most guys are napping or hiking. And I've found entire herds with no sound, no bugles, and no tracks. Just patience and sharp glass. But those moments only came because I was still glassing when others weren't. Success in the late season is about grind, right? Not just fitness, not just knowledge, but your willingness to sit longer, watch harder, and commit deeper than the guy on the next ridge. That's not just a skill, it's a mindset. And when you develop that kind of mental toughness behind the glass, elk start showing up in places where most hunters swore they weren't. Late season glassing isn't about luck. It's not about stumbling into elk. It's about discipline. It's about understanding their behavior when they're tired, pressured, and trying to survive. It's about knowing that your chances don't come from covering more miles, but from seeing what others miss, because you stayed patient long enough for those animals to reveal themselves. So here's what I want you to take with you. Know what you're glassing for. Late season bulls are survival focused. They're feeding low, bedding high, and avoiding pressure. If you don't understand their priorities, you'll glass the wrong country and wonder why you keep coming up short. Be surgical. Don't sweep. Don't scan. Dissect the mountain like a surgeon. Every shadow, every patch of timber, every snow-swept bench might be the one you've waited all season to find, but only if you glass it right. Read the elk. They're speaking with every move, even when they're bedded. If you can learn to interpret posture, pace, and pattern, you'll start seeing opportunity where others just see elk out of range. Stay in it. Stay in the fight. The guys who kill late season elk are the ones who glass through boredom, through doubt, through discomfort, through weather. They glass when nothing's moving. They glass when it's cold. They glass when it seems like a waste of time. And then, all of a sudden, the mountain rewards them. If you've made it this far, you're probably the kind of hunter who's not just looking for shortcuts. You're trying to level up. For real. And that's exactly who Team Backbone is built for. When you become a member, you're stepping into the inner circle of this community. You get full access to my members-only digital content vault, checklists, hunting guides, mindset training, backcountry fitness programming, e-scouting breakdowns, and more. We've got private community support, live Q&As, and direct access to me for strategy calls and gear help. Plus, every month, members get an exclusive Backbone Unlimited shirt shipped straight to your door, shirts that don't exist anywhere else, and that's just scratching the surface. This is for the guys who grind year-round, the ones who train for September and hunt through December, the guys who don't quit just because the weather turned or the bulls were quiet. If that's you, get in at backboneunlimited.com under our membership tab. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.